Welcome to episode 3. This episode focuses on something that many students underestimate: finding and refining your research question. One pattern that still surprises me is how often students assume that good research questions simply appear, as though there is a perfect question waiting to be discovered. In reality, developing a research question is usually much messier than that. This episode is about understanding why. And before we begin, let's briefly look back. This slide reminds us where we've come from. In episode 2, we explored the reality of the first 6 months. Most students discover they need better questions. I think this is an important statement, because one of the biggest surprises of doctoral study is that having a topic is not enough. Very quickly, students realise they need something more precise. And that brings us naturally to where we are in the journey. This slide captures a very common reality. Many students have a topic, but not a research question. At first, these may sound like the same thing. They're not. I've lost count of the number of times students have enthusiastically described their topic while being unable to explain the specific problem they wish to investigate. That is perfectly normal at this stage, because topics are broad. Research questions provide direction, and direction becomes extremely important as the doctorate progresses. This slide explains why research questions matter so much. Your research question influences every subsequent stage of the doctorate. The literature you read, the methods you choose, the data you collect, the analysis you conduct, the conclusions you draw. One thing I wish more students understood is that changing a research question is often much easier early in the doctorate than later, which is why spending time developing it properly is a worthwhile investment. And before we can do that, we need to separate topic from questions. This slide introduces a distinction that many students struggle with initially. Artificial intelligence, sustainability, leadership, these are topics, not research questions. I remember one student proudly telling me, "My PhD is about sustainability." My immediate response was, "What about sustainability?" That simple question often unlocks progress, because topics provide a territory. Research questions identify a problem within that territory. And that naturally leads us to ask another question. What actually makes a good research question? This slide introduces 5 characteristics: clear, focused, researchable, significant, original. One thing that still surprises me is how often students focus entirely on originality while neglecting the others. Originality matters, but an original question that cannot realistically be researched is not particularly helpful. These characteristics work together, and one of them deserves particular attention: significance. This slide addresses something I think universities sometimes oversimplify. Not all gaps matter. Significance matters more than absence. I have lost count of the number of times students have said, "Nobody has studied this before." That can be interesting, but it is not automatically important. There may be excellent reasons why something has never been studied. The better question is not whether a gap exists, it is whether the gap matters, which takes us directly to the next slide. This slide asks what may be one of the most important questions in doctoral education. Why does this gap matter? I would encourage you to return to this question repeatedly. Why should supervisors care? Why should examiners care? Why should practitioners care? Why should future researchers care? One pattern that still surprises me is how much clarity this single question can create, because significance often becomes easier to recognize when we focus on impact. And another thing students often struggle with is scope. This slide introduces a challenge almost everybody experiences. Most students need to narrow their problem, not expand it. I've never supervised a student who arrived wanting to study something too small. It is always the opposite. Students often begin with ideas that could occupy an entire research centre. Narrowing is not a weakness, it's a strength. Focus creates depth, and once scope becomes manageable, another concern often emerges: originality. This slide addresses another common misconception. Originality may involve new evidence, a new context, a new perspective, or a new interpretation. One thing I wish more students understood is that originality does not always mean inventing something that has never existed before. Very often it means seeing something familiar differently. That should feel reassuring, because originality is usually more achievable than students initially imagine. And yet, despite that, anxiety often remains, which brings us to the human reality. This slide perhaps captures the emotional heart of the episode. Fear of choosing wrongly is common. Every question opens some doors and closes others. I remember one candidate who delayed making a decision for months because they were afraid of selecting the wrong question. Eventually I said something very simple: no question is perfect. Progress often comes through refinement rather than perfection. That changed their thinking completely, and it also leads naturally to our next slide, because questions themselves evolve. This slide contains something I wish every doctoral student heard early. Most doctoral questions change. Refinement often reflects learning rather than failures. One pattern that still surprises me is how guilty students sometimes feel when their question changes, as though they've somehow failed. Usually the opposite is true. Change often means deeper understanding is developing, and perhaps that is why the next reflection questions matter so much. This slide asks three excellent questions. Can I explain my question in one sentence? Why does it matter? Who benefits if it's answered? I would encourage you to revisit these regularly, because good doctoral questions become progressively clearer over time. And speaking of time, let's briefly look ahead. This slide introduces episode 4, the literature review. Joining the scholarly conversation. One thing that still surprises me is how often students view literature reviews as reading exercises rather than conversations. Episode 4 will explore that idea in much more depth. But before we finish, let's briefly acknowledge the references. This slide introduces some excellent resources. These texts explain how strong research questions are developed. I would particularly encourage you not to view references as instructions to follow. View them as conversations to join. And we have one final reference slide before we conclude. This slide continues those recommendations. You will notice that several of these authors appear repeatedly throughout the programme. That is deliberate. They have spent many years helping doctoral students navigate uncertainty, and uncertainty really is the common thread connecting much of this journey. Which brings us to our closing slide. Thank you for joining me for episode 3. If there is one idea I would like you to remember, it is this. Good research questions are rarely discovered, they are developed. Allow yourself permission to refine, allow yourself permission to learn, because refinement is often evidence that the doctoral journey is working exactly as it should. And I look forward to seeing you in episode 4.